I never thought I would become the kind of person who goes to war with a homeowners association. But then again, I never expected them to declare war on me first. My name is Nathan Nash, and I have lived in the Pinewood Grove community in Boulder, Colorado for nearly 8 years. The neighborhood is beautiful, nestled against the foothills with views of the Flatirons that make you forget about your problems on a clear morning. I bought my property specifically because it had a large lot, almost 2 acres, with plenty of space for my workshop, my vehicles, and most importantly, my vintage 1989 Winnebago Chieftain that I inherited from my grandfather. That motorhome meant everything to me. My grandfather took me on road trips every summer when I was a kid, teaching me about mechanics while we broke down in the middle of Nevada or how to fish when we camped in Wyoming. When he passed away 5 years ago, he left me the Winnebago with a note that said, "Keep exploring, Nathan. The road never ends if you do not let it." So every winter, when I was not using it, I would park the motorhome on my property beside my detached garage. The spot was partially screened by a row of blue spruce trees I had planted specifically for that purpose. It was not an eyesore, it was not blocking anyone's view, and it certainly was not violating any rules that existed when I moved in. But then, Margaret Olsen became the HOA president. Margaret was the type of woman who wore pearl earrings to take out the trash and had opinions about everyone's grass height, paint colors, and apparently, where they stored their recreational vehicles. She had moved into the neighborhood 3 years ago with her husband Richard, who always looked like he wanted to apologize for her but never quite found the courage. The first indication of trouble came on a Tuesday morning in October. I was in my workshop restoring a 1967 Mustang when I heard the doorbell ring. Standing on my porch was Margaret, clipboard in hand, her lips pressed into a thin line that could cut glass. "Nathan," she said, not bothering with pleasantries, "we need to discuss your motorhome situation." I wiped the grease off my hands with a rag. What situation would that be? The HOA board has voted to implement new regulations regarding the storage of recreational vehicles on residential properties during the winter months. Effective November 1st, no RVs, boats, or similar vehicles may be stored on any property that is visible from the street or neighboring homes. I looked past her at my Winnebago, barely visible through the trees. "Margaret, you can hardly see it from the street." And the rules when I bought this place specifically allowed for RV storage on properties over 1 acre. She consulted her clipboard like it contained the secrets of the universe. "The board has determined that property values are being negatively impacted by visible recreational vehicles. You have until November 1st to make alternative arrangements. That is 3 weeks from now. And where exactly am I supposed to store a 32-foot motorhome? There are storage facilities in Boulder and Longmont. That is not the HOA's concern. We are simply enforcing community standards." She turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and there will be a fine of $100 per day for non-compliance starting November 2nd. Have a good day, Nathan." I stood there watching her walk back to her Mercedes SUV, feeling my blood pressure rise. This was not about property values or community standards. This was about control. Margaret had been systematically pushing her agenda since becoming president, and I had watched 3 families move out rather than deal with her constant harassment about fence heights, mailbox styles, and approved exterior paint colors. But I was not going to be pushed out. This was my home, my property, and my grandfather's motorhome. That evening, I pulled out my closing documents and the original HOA covenants. Sure enough, there it was in black and white. Properties exceeding 1 acre were permitted to store recreational vehicles provided they were maintained, and did not create a safety hazard. There was nothing about visibility or seasonal restrictions. I called my neighbor, Derek, who had lived in Pinewood Grove since the development was built 15 years ago. Derek was on the original HOA board before Margaret's regime took over. They cannot just change the rules like that, can they? I asked him. Derek sighed. Technically, yes, if they get a majority vote from the board. But they are supposed to give proper notice and allow for community input. Did they send out any notifications about a rule change vote? I thought back through my mail. Nothing. Just Margaret showing up at my door with the new decree. That sounds about right, Derek said bitterly. She pulled the same thing with pool regulations last summer, just announced new rules without proper process. A few people complained, but most folks do not want to fight the HOA. It is expensive and exhausting. What about you? You're on the board. Was on the board. Margaret engineered a vote last spring to reduce the board from 7 members to 5. Guess who did not make the cut? Now it is just her and 4 people who agree with whatever she says. After hanging up with Derek, I decided to attend the next HOA board meeting, which according to the community website was scheduled for the following Thursday evening at the Pinewood Grove Clubhouse. The clubhouse was a modest building with a meeting room, a small gym, and an outdoor pool that was closed for the season. When I arrived at 7 in the evening, there were maybe a dozen other residents scattered around the folding chairs. Margaret sat at the front table with 4 other board members: Helen, Patricia, Susan, and surprisingly, a younger guy named Craig who I had met once at a community barbecue. Margaret called the meeting to order with an efficiency that suggested she had somewhere else to be. They rattled through minutes from the last meeting, a discussion about holiday decoration guidelines, and a proposal to repaint the community sign at the entrance. When they opened the floor for resident concerns, I stood up. Nathan Nash, 2847 Spruce Ridge Drive. I want to discuss the new RV storage regulations that were apparently passed by this board. Margaret did not even look up from her notes. The vote was taken at our September meeting. It passed 4-1. The policy is now in effect. I checked the meeting minutes on the website. There is no mention of RV storage regulations being discussed or voted on in September. That got her attention. She looked up, her eyes cold. The minutes are summarized for brevity. Not every item is listed in detail. The original covenants clearly state that properties over 1 acre can store RVs. You cannot just override the foundational documents without a community-wide vote. The board has the authority to create reasonable restrictions in service of maintaining property values, Margaret said. This is clearly outlined in Section 12 of the governing documents. I had read Section 12. It was vague enough to be interpreted broadly, but it also included language about good faith and community consensus. This was neither. I am requesting that this rule be put to a community vote, I said, as is my right under Section 15. Margaret's jaw tightened. Noted. Your request will be considered at our next board meeting. Is there anything else? When is the next meeting? December 7th. That is more than a month away. The deadline you gave me is November 1st. That is not reasonable. Then I suggest you make arrangements quickly, Nathan. Next concern. I sat down, furious but trying to keep my composure. Craig, the younger board member, looked uncomfortable, but he said nothing. The rest of the meeting was a blur of minutiae about landscaping contracts and budget reports. As people filtered out, I caught Craig in the parking lot. "Hey, can I talk to you for a minute?" He glanced nervously toward Margaret's Mercedes, where she was talking on her phone. "Make it quick." "You voted against the RV rule," he nodded. "I thought it was overreach. We have a dozen properties with RVs or boats. It seemed like a solution in search of a problem. But Margaret pushed hard, said it was about maintaining the premium character of the neighborhood. Did she follow proper procedures? Notice to residents, opportunity for input. Craig shifted his weight. Look, I am new to this. Margaret handles most of the procedural stuff. She said it was within our authority, so I assumed she knew what she was doing. But between you and me, a lot of what she does feels off. I just have not figured out how to push back without getting kicked off the board like Derek was. Would you be willing to vote to rescind the rule? If we could get it back on the agenda, maybe. But Margaret controls what we vote on, and she is not going to voluntarily revisit this. I thanked Craig and walked to my truck, formulating a plan. If Margaret wanted to play hardball with procedures and technicalities, I could do the same. Over the next few days, I did something I probably should have done years ago. I actually read the entire HOA governing documents, all 73 pages of covenants, bylaws, and amendments. What I found was enlightening. First, any rule changes that conflicted with the original covenants required a 2/3 vote of the entire community, not just the board. Second, board meetings where rule changes were voted on required at least 14 days advance notice to all residents with specific agenda items listed. Third, residents could petition for a special meeting if they gathered signatures from 20% of homeowners. Margaret had violated at least 2 of these procedures, possibly all 3. I spent the next week going door to door through Pinewood Grove. The neighborhood had 87 homes, so I needed 18 signatures to force a special meeting. I expected it to be difficult, but I was surprised by how many people were eager to sign. The Hendersons on Aspen Way signed immediately. She fined us $300 because our trash cans were visible from the street, Mrs. Henderson said. We had them beside the garage, not even at the curb. Apparently that is against her interpretation of the rules. The Kowalskis on Maple Court had a similar story. She tried to make us remove our kids' playset because it was not an approved color. It is a playset. It is colorful. That is the point. By the end of the week, I had 32 signatures, nearly twice what I needed. I submitted the petition to the HOA board via certified mail, as required by the bylaws, requesting a special meeting to discuss the RV storage regulations and the procedures by which they were enacted. Margaret's response came 2 days later, also via certified mail. The petition was denied because the matter has already been decided by the board and does not warrant further community discussion. She cited a section of the bylaws about redundant petitions, which apparently she had the authority to interpret however she wanted. I called Derek again. Can she just ignore a valid petition? She should not be able to, but who is going to stop her? You would have to sue the HOA, which means suing yourself since we all fund it. Most people do not have the money or energy for that fight. There has to be another way. Derek was quiet for a moment. You could try going to the county. HOAs have to register their governing documents with the county clerk. If she is violating the bylaws, the county might have an interest in enforcing proper governance. But it is a long shot. I made an appointment with the Boulder County Clerk's office for the following Tuesday. The clerk, a helpful woman named Sandra, pulled up the Pinewood Grove HOA registration. What exactly are you looking for? She asked. I explained the situation with the RV regulations and the denied petition. Sandra reviewed the documents, comparing them to my copies of the bylaws. Well, based on what is registered here, it does appear the board president failed to follow proper procedure for this type of rule change. But the county does not have enforcement authority over HOA internal disputes. That is a civil matter between you and the association. So there is nothing I can do. I did not say that. You can file a complaint with the state. Colorado has an HOA information and resource center that handles governance disputes. They cannot force a resolution, but they can investigate and issue findings. Sometimes that is enough to pressure a board into compliance. Also, you could attend the board meeting and formally object on the record. If you later have to take legal action, having a clear record of objection helps your case. It was not the immediate solution I wanted, but it was something. I filed a complaint with the State Resource Center and prepared for the November 1st deadline, which was now just 4 days away. On October 30th, I received another letter from Margaret, this one via regular mail. It was a formal notice that my property would be inspected on November 2nd for compliance with HOA regulations. Any violations would result in immediate fines. I spent that evening sitting in the motorhome, running my hands over the steering wheel that my grandfather had gripped on so many journeys. The interior still smelled faintly of his pipe tobacco and the pine air fresheners he always hung from the rearview mirror. I had kept everything exactly as he left it. The maps folded in the door pockets, the coffee mug in the cup holder, even the flannel jacket hanging in the tiny closet. The idea of putting this in some impersonal storage unit felt like betraying his memory. But I also was not going to rack up $100 per day fines indefinitely while I fought the HOA. That is when I had my moment of clarity. I was not going to store the motorhome off-site, and I was not going to violate any rules because the rule itself was invalid. On November 1st, I woke up early and did nothing. The motorhome stayed exactly where it was. If Margaret wanted a fight, she would get one, but I would not make it easy by complying with an illegitimate rule. The inspection came right on schedule. At 10 in the morning on November 2nd, Margaret arrived with Helen and a guy I did not recognize carrying a clipboard and camera. They walked around my property, taking photographs and notes. I watched from my workshop window as they spent extra time documenting the motorhome. Margaret pointed at it multiple times while the clipboard guy nodded and wrote. The whole inspection took maybe 15 minutes, then they left without knocking on my door. The fine notice arrived that afternoon via email. $100 for the first day of non-compliance with RV storage regulations. The email included a link to pay online and a warning that continued violations would result in escalating consequences, including possible legal action. I saved the email, added it to my growing folder of HOA documents, and sent a response. I dispute this fine on the grounds that the regulation in question was enacted without proper procedure, as outlined in the Pinewood Grove HOA bylaws. I am prepared to discuss this matter at the next board meeting or in a court of law if necessary. Margaret's reply came within minutes. Your dispute is noted and denied. The fine stands. Each additional day of non-compliance will result in an additional $100 fine. The board meeting on December 7th is not open for discussion of matters already decided. Over the next 2 weeks, the daily fine notices kept coming. I did not pay any of them. My total alleged debt to the HOA climbed to $1,400. Other neighbors started asking me what was going on. The gossip mill in Pinewood Grove was efficient, and apparently I had become the subject of significant discussion. On November 15th, I received a certified letter informing me that the HOA was placing a lien on my property for unpaid fines, totaling $1,400, plus $200 in administrative fees. If the debt was not satisfied within 30 days, the HOA could pursue foreclosure proceedings. That word made my stomach drop. Foreclosure. Over a parking dispute. I immediately called a real estate attorney named Michael Chen, whose office was in downtown Boulder. After explaining the situation, I asked him directly, "Can they actually foreclose over this?" "Eventually, yes," Michael said. "In Colorado, HOAs have pretty broad authority to enforce their rules through liens and foreclosure. But there are procedures they have to follow, and based on what you are telling me, this HOA president has been sloppy about procedures. The problem is, fighting this will cost you money, possibly more than just paying the fines. I am not paying fines for an invalid rule. I respect that. Then here is what I recommend. File a lawsuit challenging the rule as improperly enacted. Request an injunction against the enforcement of fines while the matter is being litigated. That will stop the daily fine accumulation and put pressure on the HOA to either defend their procedures or back down." "How much will that cost for what you need?" "Probably $3,000 to $5,000 in legal fees, assuming it does not go to trial." I thanked Michael and told him I would think about it. $3,000 to fight a fight I should not have to fight, but the principle mattered. And more than that, my grandfather's motorhome mattered. That evening I was working in my garage when Derek stopped by. "Hey, I heard about the lien. That is serious, Nathan." "I know. I am looking at my options." "Listen, I am not supposed to tell you this, but I think you should know. Margaret is escalating because you are making her look bad. The State Resource Center contacted the HOA about your complaint. They are requesting copies of meeting minutes, notices, and voting records. Margaret is furious. She told someone at the clubhouse that she is going to make an example out of you." "An example of what?" "Of what happens when residents challenge her authority. She wants everyone to know that fighting the board is expensive and futile." Derek shook his head. "I am sorry, man. I wish I had been able to stop her when she first got on the board. But she has got this way of making you feel like you are the problem for questioning anything." After Derek left, I sat in my truck and just drove. Not anywhere specific, just through the neighborhoods of Boulder, past the university, up toward the mountains, thinking about what to do next. That is when I saw it. Parked in a driveway on a residential street in a neighborhood without an HOA was a massive Class A motorhome. Easily 40 feet long, far bigger and newer than mine. And it was not tucked behind trees or partially concealed. It was right there in the driveway, taking up significant space, clearly visible from the street. I slowed down to look at it more carefully, and that is when I noticed the small Pinewood Grove community sticker in the corner of the windshield. I parked and walked up to the house. An older man answered the door. "Can I help you?" "Hi, I am Nathan Nash from Pinewood Grove. I noticed your motorhome has a community sticker. Do you have a property in our neighborhood?" "Oh, sure. My wife and I have a place on Ridgeview Drive. We are there during the summer mostly." "Why?" "Is this your main residence?" "This is our daughter's house. We stay here in the winter." "Easier than dealing with snow up in Pinewood. Why are you asking?" "Just curious." "Nice motorhome." I walked back to my truck with an idea forming. If this guy had a property in Pinewood Grove, but was storing his motorhome elsewhere in the winter, that meant Margaret's rule was not being enforced equally. Selective enforcement could be a legal problem for the HOA. Over the next few days, I drove through Pinewood Grove carefully, documenting every property. What I found was revealing. There were at least 6 properties with boats on trailers, 3 with small RVs, and 2 with utility trailers that were clearly visible from the street or neighboring properties. None of them had received fine notices. I knocked on doors and asked questions. Every one of those residents told me the same thing. They had heard about the new RV rule, but no one had contacted them about compliance. The pattern was clear. Margaret was not enforcing a legitimate community-wide rule. She was targeting me specifically. Armed with this information, I called Michael Chen again and told him I wanted to move forward with the lawsuit. He drafted a complaint challenging the RV storage rule on procedural grounds and requesting an injunction against the enforcement of fines. We filed it with Boulder County Court on November 22nd. The HOA had 30 days to respond. Margaret's response was not legal or procedural. It was personal. On November 25th, 3 days after I filed the lawsuit, I came home to find a notice taped to my door. The HOA was scheduling an emergency special assessment vote for December 1st. Each homeowner would be required to pay $500 to cover unexpected legal expenses and governance challenges. I called Derek immediately. Can she do this? Special assessments require a majority vote of homeowners, not just the board. She has to get at least 44 people to approve it. Will she? Honestly, I do not know. A lot of people do not pay attention to HOA business. If she frames it right, she might get enough votes out of apathy or ignorance. The notice explained that the assessment was necessary because a resident has initiated baseless litigation against the HOA, forcing the board to retain legal counsel to defend the community's interests. It did not mention me by name, but everyone knew who it was about. Margaret was trying to turn the entire neighborhood against me by making my lawsuit cost them money. The vote was conducted online through the HOA website. I spent the days leading up to it reaching out to every neighbor I could, explaining my side of the story, showing them the evidence of selective enforcement and procedural violations. Some were sympathetic. Others just did not want to get involved. On December 1st, the vote results were posted. The special assessment had been approved by a margin of 46 to 32, with 9 households not responding. I was now part of an HOA where I was being fined daily and being forced to pay for the legal defense against my own lawsuit challenging those fines. The absurdity was almost impressive. My court hearing for the injunction was scheduled for December 14th. Michael was cautiously optimistic. The judge will look at whether you are likely to succeed on the merits and whether you will suffer irreparable harm without the injunction. The selective enforcement evidence helps, and the procedural violations are documented. We have got a decent case. December 7th arrived, the date of the regularly scheduled HOA board meeting. I attended, bringing Derek with me for moral support. The meeting room was more crowded than usual, about 30 residents, many of whom I recognized from my door-to-door petition drive. Margaret started the meeting with her usual efficiency, but there was a tension in the air that had not been there before. When she opened the floor for resident concerns, hands shot up all over the room. The first was Tom Henderson. I want to understand why we are paying for legal fees to defend a rule that was not properly enacted in the first place. Margaret's response was smooth. The rule was properly enacted according to board authority. One resident disagrees and has chosen to pursue expensive litigation rather than comply with a reasonable community standard. But I've got a boat in my driveway, another resident, Karen Miller, said. Why am I not being fined? The enforcement is being rolled out in phases, Margaret said without missing a beat. We are starting with the most significant violations. A 32-foot motorhome that is barely visible behind trees is more significant than my 24-foot fishing boat that is right in my driveway. Karen pressed. Margaret's composure cracked slightly. The board makes enforcement decisions based on multiple factors. We do not have time to debate every individual situation. Craig, the young board member, spoke up. Margaret, I think we should consider putting the RV rule to a community vote like Nathan requested. This has become divisive and maybe it is worth revisiting. The matter is closed, Craig. We have already voted as a board. But you violated procedure, I said, standing up. You did not provide proper notice. You did not allow community input. You did not follow your own bylaws. Margaret's eyes flashed. You are out of order, Nathan. Sit down. I am a resident with a right to speak during the concern period. You opened the floor. I am speaking. The room had gone completely silent. Everyone was watching to see what would happen. Your concern is noted, Margaret said coldly. Is there anything else? Yes. I want the board to vote right now to rescind the RV storage rule pending a proper community vote with appropriate notice and input. That is not on the agenda. Then I am putting it on the agenda for the next meeting. That is my right under Section 18 of the bylaws. Margaret shuffled her papers, clearly trying to regain control of the room. Fine. It will be added to the January meeting agenda. Next concern. But the floodgates had opened. For the next 40 minutes, residents aired grievances about Margaret's leadership, the lack of transparency, the aggressive enforcement of minor violations, and the general atmosphere of fear she had created. She tried to maintain her composure, but I could see the cracks widening. Finally, Craig did something I did not expect. He made a motion. I move that we vote tonight to suspend all enforcement of the RV storage rule pending a community-wide vote on the matter. Helen, one of Margaret's allies, immediately objected. You cannot make that motion. It is not on the agenda. Actually, Craig said, pulling out his own copy of the bylaws. Section 23 allows any board member to introduce a motion during a regular meeting if it relates to enforcement of existing rules. This qualifies. Margaret looked like she wanted to throw her clipboard at him. That section is for emergency safety issues. It is for any enforcement issue that requires board discretion. That is the exact language. Craig looked around at the other board members. I am calling for a vote. The room erupted in voices, some supporting Craig, others trying to defend Margaret's position. After several minutes of chaos, Margaret finally called for order. Fine, she snapped. We will vote. All in favor of suspending enforcement of the RV storage rule. Craig raised his hand immediately. Then, after a pause, Susan, another board member, raised hers as well. I think Craig is right, she said quietly. This has gotten out of hand. That was 2 votes. Margaret and Helen voted against. Everyone looked at Patricia, the 5th board member who had been silent all evening. Patricia, a woman in her 60s who had always seemed pleasant but passive, looked at Margaret, then at the crowded room of residents, then at me. I vote to suspend enforcement, she said. The motion passed 3-2. Margaret stood up so abruptly her chair scraped loudly against the floor. This meeting is adjourned. She grabbed her materials and walked out without another word. The room buzzed with conversation. People came up to thank Craig and me. Derek was grinning. I cannot believe that just happened. Neither could I, honestly, but it had. The daily fines would stop. The lien on my property could be challenged. And maybe, just maybe, the tyranny of Margaret Olsen was coming to an end. But I underestimated her capacity for revenge. 2 days later, on December 9th, I received a notice that I was being sued personally by Margaret Olsen for defamation and harassment. The lawsuit claimed that I had made false statements about her at the board meeting and during my door-to-door petition drive, damaging her reputation and causing her emotional distress. She was seeking $25,000 in damages. I called Michael Chen immediately. Can she do this? Anyone can sue anyone for anything. Whether it will go anywhere is another question. From what you have told me, you have not defamed her. You have stated facts about procedural violations. That is protected speech, especially in the context of HOA governance. But you will need to defend yourself, which means more legal fees. How much more? Depends on how far she pushes it. Could be a couple $1,000s to file a motion to dismiss. If it goes beyond that, significantly more. I hung up feeling like I was drowning. Legal fees to fight the HOA. Legal fees to defend against a personal lawsuit. The $500 special assessment, and still no resolution on the motorhome situation. That evening, I did something I had not done in years. I called my sister, Julie, who lived in Portland. We had a complicated relationship, mostly because she thought I was too sentimental about the past, and I thought she was too quick to discard anything that could not fit in a minimalist lifestyle. But she was a paralegal, and I needed someone to talk to who understood legal systems. "Nathan, why are you still fighting this?" she asked after I explained the situation. "Just move the motorhome to storage. It is not worth all this stress and money." "It is not about the motorhome, Julie. It is about someone with a little bit of power abusing it because they know most people will not fight back. If I give in, she wins. And she will do the same thing to someone else next year." Julie sighed. "You sound like Grandpa. Is that a bad thing?" "No," she said softly. "It is not. He would be proud of you. Stubborn but proud. Look, if you need help with legal costs, I can chip in some. I know this matters to you." That conversation meant more to me than she probably realized. The injunction hearing happened on December 14th as scheduled. Michael presented our case. The procedural violations, the selective enforcement, the lack of proper notice, and the evidence that the rule conflicted with the original covenants. The HOA's attorney, a sharp woman named Linda Carmichael, argued that the board had broad authority to enact reasonable restrictions, and that I was simply trying to avoid compliance with a legitimate rule. Judge Patricia Morrison listened carefully to both sides. "Here is my concern," she said, looking at the HOA attorney. "Your client enacted a rule that appears to conflict with the foundational covenants without following the procedures for amending those covenants. That is a serious governance issue. And the evidence of selective enforcement suggests this may not be about property values but about targeting a specific resident. Your Honor, the board has discretion in how it rolls out enforcement," Linda argued. "That is not selective enforcement. It is phased implementation. Phased implementation requires a plan and consistent application," the judge said. "I am not seeing that here. I am granting the preliminary injunction. All fines and liens related to the RV storage rule are suspended until this matter is resolved on the merits. The HOA is enjoined from further enforcement actions related to this rule. We will schedule a full hearing for January." I walked out of the courthouse feeling like I could breathe for the first time in weeks. Michael shook my hand. "Good outcome. Now we prepare for the full hearing. And we will file a motion to dismiss Margaret's personal lawsuit on anti-SLAPP grounds." "Anti-what?" "Anti-SLAPP. Strategic lawsuit against public participation. Colorado has a statute that protects people from lawsuits designed to silence them on matters of public concern. HOA governance definitely qualifies. If we win the motion, she might have to pay your attorney fees." That added a new dimension to the situation. Margaret had tried to weaponize the legal system against me, and it might backfire. Over the Christmas holiday, things were relatively quiet. The daily fine notices stopped. I paid the special assessment under protest, not wanting to give Margaret any more ammunition. The motorhome stayed right where it had been all along, beside the garage, under the blue spruce trees, exactly where my grandfather would have wanted it. On December 30th, I decided to take the motorhome for a drive. I had not actually driven it since October, and it needed to be exercised. I fired up the engine, which turned over after a few tries, and took it out onto the highway heading toward Estes Park. The roads were clear despite it being winter, and the views of the snow-covered mountains were stunning. I drove for about 2 hours, stopping at a scenic overlook to make some coffee in the motorhome's tiny kitchen. Sitting there, looking out at the Rockies, I understood again why my grandfather had loved this so much. It was freedom, not just the ability to travel, but the freedom to exist on your own terms. Margaret Olsen wanted to take that freedom away, not for any legitimate reason, but simply because she could. I was not going to let that happen. On my way back to Boulder, I took a different route that wound through some of the older neighborhoods. And that is when I saw something that changed everything. Parked in a driveway on Cascade Avenue, partially covered with a tarp, was a massive Tiffin Allegro bus motorhome, the kind that cost upwards of $200,000. It had been backed into the driveway, and even with the tarp, it was clearly enormous and obviously an RV. I pulled over and walked closer. There was a mailbox at the end of the driveway with a name on it. R. Olsen. Richard Olsen. Margaret's husband. I stood there processing this information. Margaret Olsen, the HOA president who had declared war on RV storage, who had fined me thousands of dollars and placed a lien on my property, who had claimed that RVs damaged property values and violated community standards, had a motorhome in her own family. I took out my phone and started documenting photos of the motorhome, the address, the mailbox, the property. I checked the county assessor's website on my phone and confirmed that Richard and Margaret Olsen owned this property as well as their home in Pinewood Grove. This was not just hypocrisy. This was grounds for challenging everything she had done. But then I had a better idea. I called Michael Chen, even though it was December 30th and I was sure he was on vacation. He answered on the 4th ring. "Nathan, this better be good. I am at my in-laws in Aspen. Margaret Olsen's husband has a 40-foot motorhome parked at a property they own in Boulder, not in Pinewood Grove, in the city where there is no HOA. There was a long pause. Are you sure? I am looking at it right now. I have got photos, property records, everything. That is interesting, but I am not sure how it helps us legally. They are not violating the HOA rule if the motorhome is not parked at their Pinewood Grove property. But it shows the rule is arbitrary and based on her personal preferences, not legitimate community interests. She is fine with RVs as long as they are not in her immediate view. That might play well in front of a judge. Send me everything you have. I will think about how to use it." After I hung up, I sat in my own motorhome in a parking lot, thinking through the situation. Margaret had made this personal. She had weaponized the HOA against me, tried to drain me financially, attempted to turn my neighbors against me, and sued me personally for daring to challenge her. It was time to return the favor. The Pinewood Grove HOA bylaws had a provision that I had noticed during my extensive reading. Any resident could petition to remove a board member for cause with a majority vote of the community. Cause included abuse of authority, failure to follow proper procedures, or actions that damaged the community's interests. I had documentation of all three. Over the next week, I put together a comprehensive packet. The procedural violations, the selective enforcement evidence, the financial cost to the community of her manufactured legal disputes. And now, the revelation that her own family owned an RV that she had simply stored elsewhere rather than face her own restrictions. On January 5th, I started going door to door again, this time with a petition to remove Margaret Olsen as HOA president and board member. I needed 44 signatures to force a vote. The response was overwhelming. People were tired of Margaret's authoritarian approach, her constant fines, her manipulation of the rules. And now they were angry about the special assessment they had to pay because of her vendetta against me. Within 4 days, I had 62 signatures. I submitted the petition to the HOA board on January 9th via certified mail. According to the bylaws, they had to schedule a special meeting within 30 days to hold the vote. Margaret's response arrived on January 12th. She rejected the petition, claiming that the removal provision only applied to board members who had committed criminal acts or gross negligence, not mere disagreements over governance. But this time I was ready. I had already filed a complaint with the Colorado Secretary of State's office and the State HOA Resource Center, documenting her violation of the petition process. I had also contacted a reporter at the Daily Camera newspaper in Boulder who covered local governance issues. The story ran on January 16th with the headline, "Boulder HOA President Faces Removal Petition Amid Claims of Abuse of Authority." It detailed the RV storage dispute, the procedural violations, the selective enforcement, and the revelation about Margaret's own family motorhome. The article included comments from several Pinewood Grove residents who spoke about the climate of fear Margaret had created. By January 18th, the story had been picked up by Denver news stations. A reporter showed up at the Pinewood Grove clubhouse with a camera crew. Margaret refused to comment. The pressure was working. On January 20th, I received notice that the HOA board had scheduled a special meeting for February 1st to vote on Margaret's removal. The notice was terse and formal, but it was a victory. However, Margaret was not going down without one final act of spite. On January 23rd, I came home to find my motorhome gone, not moved, not towed legally. Gone. There was a notice taped to the garage door where the motorhome had been parked. Vehicle removed for violation of HOA regulations. Contact American Storage and Towing for retrieval. Impound fees and fines must be paid before release. I stood there in shock, then fury. She had towed my motorhome. After losing the injunction hearing, after being served with a removal petition, after being exposed in the newspaper, Margaret Olsen had taken the nuclear option. I called the towing company immediately. "I need to speak to someone about a motorhome that was impounded from 2847 Spruce Ridge Drive." "Hold, please." After a few minutes, a manager named Bill came on the line. "Yeah, we picked up a Winnebago this morning. You the owner?" "Yes. On whose authority did you tow it?" HOA requested it, had all the paperwork, said it was unauthorized storage. There is a court injunction preventing the HOA from enforcing that rule. They had no authority to tow my vehicle. "Look, man, we just tow what we are told to tow. If you have got a legal dispute with the HOA, that is between you and them. Impound fees are $85 per day plus a $200 towing fee. You can pick it up anytime. I am not paying impound fees for an illegal tow. Then I guess your motorhome stays here." I hung up and immediately called Michael Chen. "Margaret just towed my motorhome in violation of the court's injunction." "She what? Had it impounded this morning. I've got the notice right here." "Nathan, that is contempt of court. She just gave us a massive gift. Do not pay the impound fees, do not do anything." "I am filing an emergency motion tomorrow morning. We are going to haul her in front of Judge Morrison and let her explain why she violated a court order." That evening, I drove to American Storage and Towing to verify my motorhome was actually there and document its condition. The lot was surrounded by chain-link fencing topped with barbed wire. I could see the Winnebago parked in the back corner. The attendant at the gate was a young guy named Kevin. "Can I help you?" "That is my motorhome back there. The Winnebago. I just want to make sure it is secure." "It is secure, but you cannot go in without paying the fees." I am not paying. The tow was illegal, but I want to document that my vehicle is here and undamaged. Kevin shrugged. It is here. Same condition as when we picked it up. Look, I do not care about your HOA drama, I just work here. I took photos from outside the fence and left. Michael filed the emergency motion the next morning, January 24th. It requested that the court hold Margaret Olsen in contempt for violating the injunction, order the immediate release of my motorhome without payment of impound fees, and impose sanctions. The hearing was scheduled for January 27th, which happened to be a Monday. That weekend, I barely slept. The violation was so blatant, so egregious, that part of me could not believe Margaret had actually done it. But she had. She had gambled that I would either pay the fees to get my motorhome back or that the court system would move too slowly to matter. She was wrong on both counts. Monday morning, I met Michael at the Boulder County Courthouse. Judge Morrison's courtroom was smaller than the one where we had the injunction hearing, but it felt more serious. Margaret arrived with her attorney, Linda Carmichael, who looked uncomfortable. Judge Morrison did not waste time. Miss Carmichael, explain to me why your client took action to tow Mr. Nash's motorhome 3 weeks after I explicitly enjoined the HOA from enforcement actions related to this rule. Linda cleared her throat. Your Honor, there was a miscommunication. Miss Olsen believed the injunction applied only to fines, not to physical removal of the vehicle. That is absurd, the judge said flatly. The order was clear. No enforcement actions. Towing a vehicle is absolutely an enforcement action. Did Miss Olsen read the injunction? I believe she did, Your Honor, but then she understood it and chose to violate it. That is contempt. Judge Morrison turned to Margaret. Miss Olsen, do you have anything to say? Margaret stood, her composure intact but her voice tight. Your Honor, I was acting in what I believe to be the best interests of the community. The motorhome was creating an ongoing nuisance. And stop, the judge said. You do not get to decide what is in the community's best interest in defiance of a court order. You are an HOA president, not a judge. The contempt finding is obvious. The question is what the appropriate sanction should be. Michael stood. Your Honor, we request that the motorhome be released immediately at no cost to my client, that Miss Olsen personally pay all impound fees incurred, that she pay my client's attorney fees related to this motion, and that she be ordered to cease and desist from any further harassment or enforcement actions related to this matter. Judge Morrison nodded slowly. That seems entirely appropriate. Miss Olsen, you will personally pay the impound fees for Mr. Nash's motorhome. The towing company will release the vehicle immediately. You will reimburse Mr. Nash for his attorney fees related to this motion. And let me be crystal clear. If you take any further action against Mr. Nash related to his motorhome, RV storage, or any other matter connected to this dispute, I will consider jail time for contempt. Do you understand? Margaret's face had gone pale. Yes, Your Honor. Furthermore, I am ordering expedited proceedings on the underlying case. We will have a full hearing on February 15th to resolve this matter once and for all. Miss Carmichael, make sure your client understands the severity of this situation. The hearing ended. Margaret left without looking at me. I called the towing company from the courthouse steps. This is Nathan Nash. I have a court order for the release of my motorhome without payment of fees. I will be there in 30 minutes to pick it up. We will need to see the order. I will have it with me. Michael got me a copy of the judge's order and I drove to American Storage and Towing. The manager, Bill, reviewed the paperwork with obvious displeasure. This is irregular. It is a court order. Release the vehicle. 20 minutes later, I was driving my grandfather's motorhome out of the impound lot, feeling a mixture of relief and vindication. Margaret had overplayed her hand, and it had cost her, but the war was not over yet. The special meeting to vote on Margaret's removal was scheduled for February 1st, 4 days away. I spent those days making sure everyone in Pinewood Grove knew what had happened. The illegal tow, the contempt finding, the judge's rebuke. The story was too good not to spread. On February 1st, the clubhouse was packed. Every chair was filled, and people were standing along the walls. I counted at least 70 of the 87 households represented, which was unheard of for an HOA meeting. Margaret sat at the front table with the other board members. She looked smaller somehow, diminished. Helen and Patricia were there, but Susan and Craig had deliberately positioned themselves at the opposite end of the table. Derek, as the longest-serving former board member, had been asked to moderate the meeting since Margaret obviously could not preside over her own removal vote. He called the meeting to order at 7 in the evening. "We are here for a single purpose," Derek announced. "To vote on the petition to remove Margaret Olsen as HOA president and board member. Per our bylaws, the resident who initiated the petition has 10 minutes to present the case. Nathan Nash, the floor is yours." I stood and walked to the front, my folder of documents in hand. I did not need to be dramatic or emotional. The facts were damning enough. I walked through everything. The RV storage rule enacted without proper procedure, the selective enforcement, the financial cost to the community, the personal lawsuit against me, the violation of the court injunction, the contempt finding. I showed photos of the 6 properties with boats and RVs that had never been contacted about violations. I showed the property records for the Olsen's second home where their own motorhome was stored. Margaret Olsen has used the HOA as a personal fiefdom, I concluded. She has violated our governing documents, ignored proper procedures, cost us thousands of dollars in special assessments, and damaged our community's reputation. This vote is not about me or my motorhome. It is about whether we want to live in a neighborhood governed by rules and fairness or by one person's whims and vendettas. I sat down. The room was silent. Derek called on Margaret. "You have 10 minutes to respond." Margaret stood slowly. For a moment, I thought she might actually show some humility or remorse. I was wrong. "I have served this community for 3 years," she said, her voice steady. "I have worked tirelessly to maintain property values, to enforce standards, to make Pinewood Grove a desirable place to live. Yes, I have made difficult decisions. Yes, I have enforced rules that some people found inconvenient, but that is what leadership requires. Nathan Nash has waged a personal campaign against me because he refused to comply with a reasonable community standard. He has cost this community far more in legal fees and disruption than any RV storage rule ever would have. If you remove me tonight, you are sending a message that anyone can ignore the rules if they complain loudly enough." She sat down. No apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, just defiance. Derek called for the vote. It was conducted by paper ballot to ensure accuracy and anonymity. Each household got 1 vote. The counting took about 15 minutes. Derek tabulated the results with 2 volunteer witnesses. Finally, he returned to the front table. "The results of the vote to remove Margaret Olsen as HOA president and board member are as follows: yes 59, no 12, abstain 3. The petition succeeds. Margaret Olsen is removed from the board effective immediately." The room erupted in applause. Margaret stood, gathered her materials, and walked out without a word. Helen followed her. After things settled down, Derek continued the meeting. "We need to vote on an interim president until the next regular election. I nominate Craig." The vote was unanimous. Craig, the youngest board member who had found his courage when it mattered, was now the HOA president. His first order of business was exactly what I had hoped. I move that we suspend the RV storage rule pending a proper community vote with full notice and input as required by our bylaws, Craig said. Susan seconded. The board vote was 4-0, with one vacant seat. I further move that we rescind all fines and liens against Nathan Nash related to the RV storage dispute. Another unanimous vote. And finally, I move that we conduct a full audit of HOA finances and procedures over the past 3 years to ensure compliance with our governing documents. That vote passed as well. The meeting adjourned at 9 in the evening. People came up to thank me and Craig. Derek pulled me aside. "You did it, man. You actually took her down." "We did it," I corrected. "You, Craig, Susan, Patricia. Everyone who signed the petition. This was not about me. It was about the community taking back control." The full court hearing on February 15th was almost anticlimactic. With Margaret removed from the board and the new board having rescinded the rule and all fines, there was nothing left to litigate. Michael filed a motion to dismiss the case as moot, which Judge Morrison granted. The judge did, however, make one additional order. "I am concerned about the pattern of behavior exhibited by Miss Olsen during this matter. The court's contempt finding stands. Miss Olsen's personal lawsuit against Mr. Nash is dismissed with prejudice, and she is ordered to pay his attorney fees related to that matter under Colorado's anti-SLAPP statute. The total amount is $8,300. Margaret had to pay me $8,000 for her attempt to silence me with a baseless lawsuit. The check arrived on March 2nd. It was possibly the most satisfying piece of mail I had ever received. The community vote on RV storage happened in April. The question was simple. Should the HOA maintain the September rule prohibiting RV storage on properties visible from streets or neighboring homes, or should it return to the original covenant allowing RV storage on properties over 1 acre? The vote was not even close. 71 households voted to return to the original covenant. 8 voted to maintain the restriction. On April 15th, I drove my grandfather's motorhome into the driveway and parked it in its usual spot beside the garage, under the blue spruce trees. I sat in the driver's seat for a while, just appreciating the moment. My phone rang. It was my sister Julie. "I saw the news article," she said. "You won." "Yeah, we won. Grandpa would be proud. I am proud too, even if I thought you were crazy for fighting this long." "Thanks, Julie. That means a lot. So what are you going to do now?" I looked out the windshield at the mountains in the distance. "I think I am going to take a road trip. Wyoming, maybe Montana, see where the road leads. In that old motorhome. In this old motorhome." After hanging up, I went inside and started planning. The Winnebago needed some maintenance after sitting through the winter and spending time in an impound lot, but nothing major. New oil, fresh tires, a tune-up. By early May, it would be ready for the road. Life in Pinewood Grove returned to normal, or at least a better version of normal. Craig proved to be a competent and fair HOA president. The board established clearer procedures for rule changes, required community input on major decisions, and generally operated with transparency that had been missing under Margaret's leadership. Margaret and Richard sold their Pinewood Grove home in June and moved full-time to their property in Boulder. I saw her once at a grocery store in July. We made eye contact briefly. She looked away first and turned down a different aisle. There was nothing more to say. The financial audit of the HOA revealed some concerning irregularities in how Margaret had allocated funds, particularly related to landscaping contracts with a company owned by her cousin. Nothing criminal, but enough that the board had to renegotiate several contracts and implement better oversight. The special assessment for legal fees was refunded to all residents once it became clear the money had not actually been needed. In August, I finally took that road trip. I drove the Winnebago through Wyoming, stopping at the same campgrounds my grandfather and I had visited when I was a kid. I fished in the same streams, parked at the same overlooks, and made coffee in the tiny kitchen every morning while watching the sunrise. At a campground near Jackson Hole, I met an older couple from Arizona who were full-time RVers. We got to talking, and I told them the whole story about the HOA battle. "We lived in an HOA once," the wife Carol said. "Hated every minute of it. That is why we sold everything and hit the road. Nobody tells us where we can park anymore." Her husband Tom laughed. "Best decision we ever made, but I am glad you fought them. Somebody has to stand up to these little tyrants." We shared dinner that night, grilling steaks and trading stories. They were heading toward Montana, and I was heading home, but we exchanged contact information and promised to meet up again. Driving back to Colorado in late August, I thought about what the whole experience had taught me. It was not really about RV storage or HOA rules or even justice, though all of those mattered. It was about the importance of standing up for yourself and your community when someone abuses their authority. It was about the fact that most tyrants only have power because good people decide it is not worth the fight. Margaret Olsen had counted on me being too tired, too intimidated, or too broke to challenge her. She had built her little empire on the assumption that most people would just comply rather than resist. She had been wrong. I pulled into Pinewood Grove on a Thursday evening in late August, the motorhome running smoothly after 3,000 miles of mountain roads. I parked it in its spot beside the garage under the blue spruce trees that had grown a bit taller over the summer. Derek came over with a beer to welcome me home. "How was the trip?" "Exactly what I needed. Things have been quiet here, boring even. It is nice." We sat on my porch as the sun set behind the mountains, not talking much, just enjoying the peace. The motorhome sat exactly where it belonged, where it had always belonged, where the HOA bylaws and the county court and basic fairness all said it could be. More importantly, my grandfather's legacy sat there intact, ready for the next adventure, proof that sometimes the right thing to do is the hard thing, and that standing up to bullies is worth whatever it costs. I never did move that motorhome to storage, and nobody ever asked me to again.